My name is Maria Rodriguez, and what I am about to tell you happened during the summer of 1978 in Redwood National Park. I was 35 then, working as a park ranger after spending 8 years in the military as a tracker. I thought I'd seen everything there was to see in these ancient forests. I was wrong. It all started with the drought, the worst one anyone could remember. The giant redwoods were stressed, their needles dropping more than usual, making the forest floor extra crunchy under our boots. But that wasn't what worried me most. It was the strange marks I spotted way up on one of the oldest trees, about 300 feet high, almost as tall as a football field is long. Now, I'd climbed these trees hundreds of times for my job. I know every kind of mark an animal could make, every type of damage from storms or lightning. But these were different. They looked like huge claw marks, but they were too high up for any animal I knew about, and they were fresh. I probably would have just filed it away as something weird to keep an eye on, but then the reports started coming in. First, it was a solo climber who never came back down. We searched for 3 days but found nothing, not even their gear. Then another went missing 2 weeks later. By the time the third person vanished, everyone at the park knew something wasn't right. I remember the day I found the petroglyphs. I was checking one of the less traveled trails when I noticed some faded red markings on a rock face. Years of military tracking had taught me to spot things that looked out of place, and these definitely did. After clearing away some moss, I found myself staring at ancient drawings that made my skin crawl. They showed tall, shadowy figures in the trees, and underneath were words in a Native American language that one of our archaeologists later translated, "Sky People." I didn't want to believe it meant anything, but then I got the photos back from the motion-activated cameras we'd set up to track mountain lion activity. Most of them were normal: deer, foxes, the usual forest life. But there was one photo, taken just after sunset, that made my heart stop. Between two massive redwoods, barely visible in the dying light, was a huge, dark shape. It seemed to be leaping from one tree to another, but that was impossible. The trees were at least 50 feet apart. That's when I knew we weren't dealing with anything normal. And that's when things started getting much, much worse. A week after finding that strange photo, a team of 4 researchers arrived at the park. They were studying how redwoods cope with drought, but I warned them about the disappearances. They just laughed it off, telling me they'd climbed trees all over the world. I wish they had listened. The team set up their equipment in 3 different trees. They had these fancy cameras and something called audio spectrometers that could pick up sounds humans can't hear. Everything was fine for the first 2 days. They'd climb up in the morning, do their work, and come down before dark. But on the 3rd day, only 3 of them came down. Mike stayed up to check some readings. Sarah, one of the researchers, told me. He said he'd be down in an hour. But Mike never came down. When we climbed up to look for him the next morning, all we found was his notebook, ripped to pieces. His other equipment was scattered across 3 different trees, and these trees were far apart, too far for someone to jump between them. What scared me most was the fresh claw marks around his climbing rope, which had been torn clean through. I started spending my nights in a camping platform high up in the trees, watching and listening. That's when I began noticing things that didn't make sense. Strange lights would flicker between the branches, but they didn't move like flashlights. They danced and swayed, almost like they were alive. And the sounds. I'd never heard anything like them. Deep, rumbling noises that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They made my chest vibrate and left me feeling dizzy. One night, I found something that changed everything. About 280 feet up, hidden in a massive gap between 2 trunks, there was a nest. But this wasn't any normal animal nest. It was huge, bigger than my apartment, and made from a weird mix of branches, bark, and human things. I found pieces of old backpacks, torn climbing ropes, and even a camera from the 1950s, all woven together like some twisted art project. The really strange part? The items were arranged in perfect patterns. This wasn't just an animal storing things it found. Whatever made this nest was smart. Really smart. I knew I had to document everything. I took photos and collected samples, even though my hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the camera. Just as I was about to leave, I heard it, a sound that turned my blood to ice. It was like a mix between a whale song and thunder, but it seemed to come from inside my own head. The branches around me started to sway, even though there wasn't any wind. That's when I saw it. Through a gap in the branches, about 60 feet away, something moved, something big. I only caught a glimpse, but what I saw didn't make any sense. It was like a shadow coming to life, but solid enough to bend the branch it was standing on. The shape looked almost human, but it was all wrong. Too tall, too fluid in its movements. I didn't stick around to see more. I got down from that tree faster than I'd ever moved in my life. Back in my office, looking at the photos I'd taken, I knew I needed help. This was bigger than anything I could handle alone. But who would believe me? Who would be crazy enough to go up there with me to find out what was really going on? Turns out, I was about to find out. Because the next morning, I got a call from a special research team that had heard about our missing climbers. And they weren't just interested, they were already on their way. The special team arrived in 2 black vans early the next morning. There were 5 of them: Dr. Chen, who studied ancient languages; Tom, a wildlife expert who'd worked with gorillas in Africa; Lisa, who knew everything about climbing and rescue operations; Marcus, who handled all sorts of high-tech equipment; and Jack, their team leader, who had this way of making you feel like everything would be okay even when it wouldn't. "We've been tracking similar incidents in other forests," Jack told me as we shared coffee in my office. "But this is the first time we've found so much evidence in one place." I showed them everything I'd collected: the photos, the weird bits from the nest, the recordings of those strange sounds. Dr. Chen got really excited about the petroglyphs, saying they matched stories he'd heard from other parts of the world. Tom studied my photos of the claw marks and went quiet. "These weren't made by any animal I know," he said, shaking his head. "They're too precise, too purposeful." We spent 3 days setting up our base camp in the canopy. Marcus brought equipment I'd never seen before: special cameras that could see in the dark, devices that could detect movement from far away, and something he called a sonic mapper that could create 3D pictures of the space between trees using sound. That's when the weird stuff really started happening. First, our equipment began picking up patterns in those deep, rumbling sounds I'd heard before. Dr. Chen said they weren't random. They were a language. But unlike any human language he'd ever studied, then our movement sensors started going crazy at night, showing something big moving between the trees at speeds that should have been impossible. But the scariest part? The things we started seeing with our own eyes? It happened on our 4th night up in the trees. We were all at different stations, connected by radio, when Lisa's voice came through, shaking. "T, here is something out here with me. It's watching me." I was closest to her position, about 2 trees away. Through my night vision binoculars, I could see her small platform swaying slightly in the darkness. Then I saw something that made me forget how to breathe. A shape, darker than the night around it, rose up behind her platform. It was huge, maybe 12 feet tall, and seemed to shift and change like smoke, but it was definitely solid. It moved with this terrible grace, like water flowing upward. "Lisa," I whispered into my radio, "don't turn around, just clip into your safety line. Now." But before she could move, the thing did something impossible. The air around it seemed to shimmer, like heat waves rising from hot pavement, and suddenly, I couldn't see it anymore. Not because it was gone, but because my brain couldn't understand what I was looking at. It was like trying to focus on something that kept sliding away from my thoughts. Lisa screamed. Not a normal scream, it was the kind of sound that haunts you forever. By the time I got to her platform, she was curled up in a ball, shaking but unhurt. She kept saying the same thing over and over. "It was in my head. It was in my head." When we got her down and calmed her enough to talk, she told us what happened. She said the creature hadn't just appeared behind her, it had somehow put images directly into her mind. She saw flashes of other people, other climbers, from years and years ago. She saw massive shapes moving through the ancient forest, living in perfect harmony with the trees. and she saw something else. Something that finally helped us understand what we were dealing with. These weren't just creatures hiding in the forest. This was a civilization, one that had been here long before us, living high above the ground where no one thought to look. And they had remained hidden for a reason. But now they were revealing themselves to us. The question was, why? We were about to find out, and the answer would cost us dearly. After what happened to Lisa, we should have left. We should have climbed down those trees and never looked back, but we didn't. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe those creatures were somehow making us stay. Either way, we kept going higher, deeper into their world. Marcus's equipment started picking up patterns we hadn't noticed before. The creatures weren't just random. They moved between certain trees at specific times, like they were following streets in a city we couldn't see. Some trees had more activity than others, like their versions of downtown buildings. "Look at this," Marcus said one morning, showing me his 3D map. "They've created a whole network up here. See these larger spaces? They're like meeting places." Dr. Chen made another discovery that gave us all chills. He'd been recording their sounds and slowing them down. "They're not just communicating," he explained, his face pale. "They're telling stories, stories about us, about all the people who've come into their territory over the years." That's when Tom went missing. We'd split up to cover more ground, something we shouldn't have done. Tom was checking out what looked like another nest when his radio crackled. "Guys," he said, his voice weird and distant, "I think I understand now. They're showing me. Oh God." Then nothing but static. We found his equipment scattered across 3 different trees, just like the others. But this time, they left us a message. Carved into the bark with those same huge claw marks was a picture, crude but clear. It showed people cutting down trees, and above them, angry shapes watching from the canopy. "They're protecting something," Jack said, studying the carving. "This isn't random. They're organized. They have a purpose." That night, we made our biggest mistake. We decided to climb to the very top of the oldest tree in the area, a giant that was over 300 feet tall and wider than a car. The locals called it the grandfather tree. We thought maybe we'd find answers there. We were right, but not in the way we expected. About halfway up, Lisa spotted something strange, a kind of platform made from branches and what looked like old metal pieces. As we got closer, we realized what it was made from: pieces of logging equipment. Old saws, axes, chains, all twisted and woven into the branches like some kind of warning. Then we found the cave. It wasn't a real cave, of course. Trees don't have caves. But over hundreds, maybe thousands of years, these creatures had hollowed out part of the trunk, creating a space big enough for several people to stand in. The walls were covered in more of those petroglyphs, but newer, fresher. Dr. Chen's hands shook as he shined his light on them. "These tell their history," he said. "They've been here since before the pyramids. This was their home. And then..." He never finished that sentence. The light caught something at the back of the cave, something that made us all stop breathing for a second. Bones. Human bones. Dozens of them, arranged in careful patterns on carved wooden shelves. "They're not killing people randomly," I whispered, the truth finally hitting me. "These are the ones who threatened their home. Loggers, developers, anyone who tried to destroy the old trees." That's when we heard it, that deep, thundering sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But this time it was angry. The whole tree started to vibrate, and the air filled with that strange shimmering effect. "Run!" I screamed, but it was too late. Shapes emerged from the darkness all around us, massive, fluid forms that seemed to shift between shadow and solid. I saw Jack get pulled into the darkness so fast he didn't even have time to scream. Marcus tried to use his equipment to do something, but one of the creatures simply reached out and crushed it in its hand, like it was made of paper. Dr. Chen just stood there, staring at them with a strange look on his face. "They're not just protecting the trees," he said quietly. "They're protecting something beneath them, something sacred." Then the biggest one I'd ever seen appeared right in front of us. It had to be at least 15 feet tall, and its eyes. Its eyes looked ancient and intelligent and terrifying all at once. And then, for the first time, they didn't just push images into our minds. They spoke. The creature's voice wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It was like thunder and whispers mixed together, somehow forming words in English. "You have seen too much." Lisa grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. Marcus was frozen in place. "Doctor." Chen, though, stepped forward. "We understand now," he said. "You are protecting the ancient burial ground under these trees." The creature's form rippled like water in moonlight. "For thousands of years, we have guarded this place. The oldest of our people rest beneath these roots. But now..." Suddenly, images flooded my mind, clear as movies but feeling completely real. I saw logging companies marking trees for cutting. I saw construction plans for a new road that would cut right through the heart of the old-growth forest. I saw everything these creatures had been protecting for longer than human civilization had existed. "The drought has weakened the trees," the creature continued. "The humans think this is their chance to take more. We cannot allow this." That's when we heard the helicopters. The sound echoed through the canopy, metal blades chopping through the night air. Spotlights swept through the branches. A voice boomed over a loudspeaker. "This is Forest Service Emergency Response. We've tracked your emergency signals. Hold your position." The creatures around us turned to look up, their forms becoming more solid, more angry. I could feel their rage building like a storm. The big one that had spoken to us let out a sound that made my teeth rattle. Some kind of signal. Dozens of massive shapes began moving through the trees toward the helicopters. "Wait!" I shouted. "If you attack them, they'll bring more people, more machines. They'll destroy everything trying to find out what happened." The lead creature turned back to me, its eyes like deep pools of ancient wisdom and fury. "Then what would you suggest, Maria Rodriguez? You who have hunted us, who have invaded our home?" I took a deep breath. "Let me talk to them. I can tell them this area is unstable, unsafe for logging. I can help protect your secret, but only if you let me do it my way." Lightning flashed in the distance. A summer storm was rolling in. The creature seemed to think for a moment, its form swaying like branches in the wind. Above us, the helicopters were getting closer. We could hear more vehicles arriving below. "Why should we trust you?" the creature asked. "Because I've seen what you really are," I said. "You are not monsters. You are guardians. And I am a guardian too. It's my job to protect this park. We can work together, or we can both lose everything we're trying to protect." The storm was getting closer now. Lightning lit up the sky every few seconds, making the creature's forms flicker like old movie projections. I could feel the tension building, like the whole forest was holding its breath. That's when Lisa spoke up, her voice shaking but strong. "They could have killed us all already. They've been protecting this place for thousands of years without turning it into a war zone. Maybe it's time for both sides to find a better way." The lead creature turned its ancient eyes toward the approaching helicopters, then back to us. In that moment, as thunder rolled overhead and rain began to fall, everything hung in the balance. Our lives, their secret, the future of this ancient place. It all came down to what would happen in the next few minutes. And then the creature made its decision. The creature raised its massive arms, and suddenly, all the other shapes retreated into the darkness of the trees. The helicopters were almost on top of us now, their spotlights dancing through the branches like artificial lightning. "We will trust you," the creature said, its voice somehow cutting through the noise of the approaching helicopters. "But know this, if you betray us, if you bring harm to our sacred ground..." It didn't finish the threat. It didn't need to. "What about Jack and Tom?" Lisa asked. "And all the others?" The creature's form rippled. "They are alive. Changed, but alive. They chose to stay, to learn our ways, to help protect this place." As if to prove its point, two familiar shapes stepped out of the shadows, but they weren't quite human anymore. They moved like the creatures did, fluid and impossible, caught somewhere between what they had been and what they had become. I didn't have time to process this because the first helicopter was right above us now. Its spotlight pinned us like bugs on a card. The creature and its kind had already vanished, or rather, they were still there, but somehow making our minds slide right past them like they didn't exist. "Down here!" I shouted, waving my arms. "We need immediate evacuation. The storm is making this whole section unstable." What happened next was a blur of rescue operations, explanations, and carefully crafted half-truths. I told them about how we discovered severe structural weaknesses in the oldest trees, about underground cave systems that made the whole area dangerous for logging. I showed them evidence of soil instability and root system problems, all real issues I'd documented over the years, just not the real reason we needed to protect this place. Dr. Chen backed me up with scientific language that sounded impressive enough to make everyone nervous about the liability of trying to develop this section of the forest. Marcus's damaged equipment had just enough data left to support our story without revealing what really lived in these trees. And the whole time, I could feel them watching us, ancient eyes following our every move, making sure we kept our word. The Forest Service eventually declared the entire section of old-growth forest off-limits for logging or development. They put up warning signs about unstable ground and dangerous conditions. Perfect cover for what really needed to be protected. Lisa and Marcus left the park as soon as they could, trying to put the whole thing behind them. Dr. Chen stayed for a while, recording what he could of the creature's language and history, but always from a respectful distance. He understood now that some knowledge isn't meant to be shared with the wider world. As for me, I am still here, still a ranger at Redwood National Park. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the fog rolls in through the canopy, I climb up to my old observation platform. And sometimes, if I am very still and patient, I catch glimpses of massive shapes moving between the trees. Once in a while, I even hear that deep, thundering language echoing through the branches. The hikers and tourists who visit the park now walk right under them, never knowing that they're being watched by creatures that have guarded these trees since before humans built their first cities. The creatures keep their part of the bargain. No one has vanished from the park since that night. And I keep mine, making sure their home and their secrets stay protected. But I've learned something important from all this. Sometimes the best way to protect something isn't to fight about it, but to find a way to help others protect it too, even if they don't know exactly what they're protecting. The old-growth forest is safe now, and with it, the ancient guardians who live above our heads continue their eternal watch. Just remember, next time you are walking through an old forest and feel like something's watching you from above, something probably is. And if you are lucky, you'll never know just how right you are. My name is Michael Blackwood, and I've been a park ranger at Joshua Tree National Park for over 15 years. The desert has been my home, my workplace, and lately, my nightmare. I never thought I'd be writing this down, but people need to know what happened during that scorching summer of 1992. The temperatures hit record highs that year, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer like water and turns car steering wheels hot enough to burn your hands. It all started when Jenny, one of our junior rangers, radioed in about some weird rock formations near Hidden Valley. Now, I know every inch of this park like the back of my hand. The desert might look empty to visitors, but to us rangers, each rock, each cactus has its place. These new formations, they definitely weren't there the day before. "Mike, you need to see this." Jenny's voice crackled through the radio. "These rocks, they're arranged in a perfect circle, and they're black, like obsidian, but different." I drove out there in my old Park Service Jeep, expecting to find some elaborate visitor prank. The desert attracts all kinds, from artists to conspiracy theorists. But what I found made my skin crawl, despite the 100-degree heat. The rocks weren't just arranged in a circle. They were twisted into impossible shapes, like melted wax frozen in time. They had a surface that seemed to swallow light, and when I touched one, it felt wrong. Not hot, like sun-baked stone should be, but ice cold. That was just the beginning. Over the next few days, we got 3 missing persons reports, all in the same area. We found their cars, but no footprints leading away from them. Just deep scratches in the metal, like something with massive claws had tried to peel them open like tin cans. I've seen mountain lion attacks. I've dealt with lost hikers and drug runners. But this was different. The way the metal was torn. No animal I know could do that. And then there were the marks we found nearby. Ancient petroglyphs that old Joe Running Bear, one of our local guides, said he'd never seen before. They showed strange, stretched-out figures emerging from the sand, with a warning written in symbols, "Beware the sandwalkers." I didn't believe in monsters. 15 years in the desert teaches you that most mysteries have simple explanations. But as I sat in my cabin that night, watching the dust storm roll in across the darkening desert, I saw something move between the Joshua trees. Something big. Something that walked like a man but moved like flowing sand. And then the screaming started. That's when I knew our peaceful desert was about to become a battlefield. And I had no idea how to fight an enemy that could melt into the landscape itself. The next morning, I went straight to the tribal office on the edge of the park. That's where I met Sarah Running Bear, Joe's daughter. She was different from other trackers I'd worked with, quiet, but her eyes missed nothing. She'd grown up hearing the old stories about the desert, and right now, I needed someone who knew those stories. The Sandwalkers, she said, spreading out some old leather-bound books on her desk. My grandmother used to warn us about them. We thought they were just stories to keep kids from wandering into the desert alone. I told her about the rocks, the missing people, and what I'd seen in the dust storm. She didn't laugh or think I was crazy. Instead, she got real quiet and pulled out an old photo. Last month, I found these tracks. The picture showed weird marks in the sand, like someone had dragged massive fingers through it, but the pattern was all wrong. They disappeared into solid rock. Just then, my radio crackled. "Mike, come in!" It was Jenny again, her voice shaking. "We found another empty car at Skull Rock. But T here is something else. The temperature around it, it's below freezing." Sarah and I jumped into my Jeep and raced out there. The air got colder as we got closer, even though it was noon and burning hot everywhere else. The car sat empty, driver's door open. The windows were covered in frost, in the middle of the desert, in summer. That's when we heard it, a sound like sand sliding down a dune, but louder and somehow wrong. Sarah grabbed my arm and pointed. About 50 feet away, the air was bending, like looking through water. And in that bend, something was taking shape. It started as a pile of sand, but then it grew taller, forming what looked like legs, arms, and a head, but not quite human. Its skin looked like moving sand, and where its face should be, there were just deep, dark holes. "Don't move," Sarah whispered. "They hunt by movement." We stood frozen as the thing turned its head toward us. My heart was beating so hard I thought it would give us away. The creature took one step forward, its foot sinking into solid rock like it was soft clay. Then my radio squawked, just static, but it was enough. The thing's head snapped toward us, and those dark holes seemed to get deeper, like endless tunnels. Sarah shoved me hard and yelled, "Run!" We sprinted back to the Jeep as the air filled with that horrible sliding sound, now from all directions. I fumbled with the keys, looking up just in time to see more shapes rising from the desert floor. Sarah slammed her door shut as I finally got the engine started. As we sped away, I checked the rear-view mirror. The creatures were sinking back into the ground, becoming one with the desert again. But I knew they weren't gone. They were watching, waiting, and somehow, I knew this was just the beginning. Whatever these things were, they were getting bolder. The question was, what did they want? Sarah's face was grim as she studied her grandmother's books. Here is more to this story," she said. "Much more, and I don't think we're going to like what we find." Back at the ranger station, things got even stranger. We'd called in 2 search and rescue teams to look for the missing people. Neither team came back. Their radios just went dead, one after another, like someone was flipping off switches. I was about to call in a 3rd team when a bunch of black SUVs pulled up to the station. Men in dark suits stepped out, looking way too neat and clean for the desert. Their leader introduced himself as Agent Phillips, but didn't say which government agency he was from. "This area is now under federal jurisdiction," he said, not even asking how we were doing. "We'll take it from here." But Sarah wasn't having any of it. While the agents were setting up their equipment, she pulled me aside and whispered, "They know something. Look at their gear. It's not normal search and rescue stuff." She was right. Through the window, I could see them unloading weird-looking machines with blinking lights and screens that showed heat patterns. They knew what we were dealing with. That night, Sarah and I snuck back to Skull Rock. The agents had set up a perimeter, but we knew the desert better than they did. We found a gap in their patrol and slipped through. The cold spot was still there, but now it was bigger. Sarah pointed to the ground. In the moonlight, we could see tiny cracks spreading out from the empty car, like a spider web made of shadows. When we shined our flashlights on them, the beams seemed to bend toward the cracks. "Look," Sarah whispered, pointing to a bigger crack. It was about 2 feet wide, and it went straight down into darkness. But the weird part? There was a cool breeze coming up from it. In all my years as a ranger, I'd never felt anything like it. We tied ropes to a nearby rock and started climbing down. The walls of the crack were smooth, like they'd been melted. Our flashlight beams showed more tunnels branching off in all directions. Some looked ancient, with those same petroglyphs we'd seen before. Others looked fresh, like they'd just been made. That's when we heard voices echoing up from below, human voices. We followed them, trying to stay quiet. The tunnel opened into a huge cave, and what we saw made us both freeze. The government agents had another way in. They'd set up some kind of base down here, with computers and strange equipment. On their screens, we could see red dots moving through the tunnel system. Some dots were bigger than others, and they moved in ways that nothing natural should move. "Sir," one of the agents said, "they're becoming more active. The readings are off the charts." Agent Phillips stepped into view, looking at a map spread out on a table. "It's happening faster than we predicted. They're trying to open it again." "Open what?" Sarah whispered. Right then, the ground started shaking. Not like a normal earthquake, this felt different, like something huge was moving deep below us. The agents started shouting and grabbing their gear. A sound filled the cave, that same sliding sand noise, but so loud it hurt our ears. And it was coming from all around us. "Run!" I yelled, not caring if the agents heard us. We scrambled back up the rope as the tunnel walls began to move. Looking back, I saw something that still gives me nightmares. The walls weren't just shaking, they were transforming. The sandwalkers were emerging from everywhere, their bodies forming out of the solid rock. We barely made it out. Behind us, we could hear screaming and that awful sliding sound. When we finally stopped running and looked back at Skull Rock, there was no sign of the entrance we'd used. The crack had sealed itself like it was never there. Sarah grabbed my arm, her face pale in the moonlight. "Mike," she said, "I know what they're trying to open. My grandmother's stories. They weren't just about the sandwalkers. They were about what the sandwalkers were guarding." Sarah and I huddled in my cabin as she explained the truth. Her grandmother's stories told of an ancient doorway deep in the desert, a gateway to somewhere else. The sandwalkers weren't trying to hurt people, they were trying to protect them. They were guards, making sure nothing came through from the other side. But now, Something was changing. The extreme heat, the missing people, the government agents. It all pointed to one thing. The doorway was starting to open on its own. Just then, the wind picked up outside. But this wasn't a normal desert wind. The air turned brown with sand, and through my cabin windows, I could see shapes moving in the storm, dozens of them, all heading toward Skull Rock. "We have to stop them," Sarah said, pulling out her grandmother's oldest book. "If that doorway opens fully—" She didn't need to finish. We both knew it would be bad. We drove back to Skull Rock in the worst sandstorm I'd ever seen. The wind was so strong it nearly pushed my Jeep off the road. The temperature kept dropping. Our breath was making clouds in the air, even though it was still daytime. When we got there, it looked like a war zone. The government agents were scrambling around, their equipment sparking and failing. The ground was cracking open everywhere, and those cracks were glowing with a weird purple light. "There." Sarah pointed at the biggest crack. It was more like a cave mouth now, and that purple light was pouring out of it. The sandwalkers were gathering around it, their bodies shifting between sand and solid form. They were trying to push the crack closed, but it kept getting bigger. Sarah pulled out some things from her bag: herbs, crystals, and a small drum. "My grandmother taught me the sealing ritual," she said. "But Mike, it needs a sacrifice. Something to replace the energy that's making the doorway open." I looked at her face and knew what she was thinking. "No," I said, "there has to be another way." But there wasn't time to argue. The crack suddenly burst open wider, and we saw what was on the other side. I can't really describe it. My mind doesn't want to remember. But imagine if someone turned space inside out and filled it with things that shouldn't exist. The sandwalkers formed a circle around the opening, their bodies glowing with the same purple light. Sarah started beating her drum and singing in her native language. The sound seemed to make the air itself vibrate. That's when I made my decision. While Sarah was focused on her ritual, I slipped past her and ran toward the doorway. I could feel it pulling at me, trying to drag me in. Behind me, I heard Sarah screaming my name. The sandwalkers turned to look at me, their empty faces somehow showing surprise. I reached the edge of the doorway and looked back at Sarah. "Tell Jenny she's in charge of the park now," I shouted. Then I jumped. I felt the cold hit me like a wall, but instead of falling through, I became part of the doorway itself. I could feel my body spreading out, filling the cracks, becoming the seal that would keep the gateway closed. The last thing I saw was Sarah finishing her ritual, tears streaming down her face. The sandwalkers bowed their heads to me, acknowledging my sacrifice. Then everything went dark. I am still here, part of the desert now. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I can feel Sarah visiting, leaving small offerings near Skull Rock. The sandwalkers are still around too, I can sense them, patrolling their ancient paths. We guard the doorway together now. The official story says I went missing during a sandstorm. The government covered up everything else. But if you are ever in Joshua Tree and you feel a cold spot on a hot day, or see shapes moving in a dust storm, now you know the truth. Just remember, not all monsters are evil, and sometimes the scariest things in the desert are the ones trying to protect us from something even worse. A year has passed since that day at Skull Rock. Jenny runs the park now, just like I asked. She's good at her job, maybe even better than I was. She makes sure nobody goes near the area where it all happened. Sarah still works with the Park Service as a guide. She never tells the full story, but she makes sure every ranger knows about the dangerous areas to avoid during sandstorms. Sometimes, I can feel her sitting near my old cabin, talking to me about her day. I wish I could answer. The government people never came back. They took all their equipment and files, cleaned everything up like nothing ever happened. But they couldn't erase all the signs. The temperature around Skull Rock stays cooler than anywhere else in the park, even on the hottest days. The missing people were never found. Their families still come to the park sometimes, leaving flowers and photos. I watch over these memorials, and so do the Sandwalkers. We've become a kind of family now, silent guardians of this desert and its secrets. Last week, a young ranger found some strange footprints near the old site. She radioed Sarah about them. I watched as Sarah walked out there, knelt down, and smiled. She knew I was watching. "We're keeping your secret, Mike," she whispered. "The desert is safe." The Sandwalkers still patrol every night. Visitors sometimes see them in dust devils or dancing shadows at sunset. But now they move differently, less threatening, more protective. They know they're not alone in their ancient duty anymore. The desert has changed me. I am not exactly human anymore, but I am not exactly a Sandwalker either. I am something in between, a bridge between two worlds. On quiet nights, when the moon is full and the wind is still, I can almost take shape again, like a shadow made of sand. But you know what? I am at peace with it. Some people spend their whole lives looking for a purpose. I found mine. Every time I feel the desert wind or watch the sun set behind the Joshua trees, I know I made the right choice. Just remember, if you ever visit Joshua Tree and feel a cool breeze on a hot day or see a shadow move when it shouldn't, don't be afraid. That's just me and my new family, keeping watch, making sure the doorway stays closed, protecting our desert and all the people in it. Because some boundaries should never be crossed, and some sacrifices are worth making. The desert holds many secrets. Now I am one of them. My name is Derek Johnson, and I've been a park ranger at the Atchafalaya National Wildlife Refuge for nearly 20 years now. Born and raised right here in Louisiana, I know every creek, every tree, and every sound these swamps make. Or at least, I thought I did until that terrible spring of 1963. I remember it all started during the worst flooding we'd seen in decades. The water was so high that even the oldest cypress trees looked like they were swimming. The air was thick and heavy, filled with mosquitoes and the constant chorus of frogs. But something felt different that year. Wrong, somehow. It was on a muggy Tuesday morning when I found the first dead alligator. Now, finding a dead gator isn't unusual in my line of work, but this was different. The poor creature had been cut open in ways that made no sense. Its scales were arranged in strange patterns, like someone had tried to make a puzzle out of them. And its eyes, well, they were missing, replaced with what looked like small, round stones. I called in Billy, our local wildlife expert, to take a look. He'd been handling gators longer than I'd been alive, but even he scratched his head at this one. "Never seen nothing like it, Derek," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "This ain't no normal predator attack, and it sure ain't poachers neither." Over the next few days, we found 4 more gators in the same condition, each one arranged the same way with those weird stone eyes. The old folks in the nearby Cajun communities started whispering about the Rougarou, the legendary werewolf that's said to haunt these parts. I'd grown up hearing those stories, but they were just that, stories. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. Then came the lights. Small, blue-green orbs dancing through the deepest parts of the swamp at night. At first, I thought they were just swamp gas or fireflies, but they moved with purpose, like they were searching for something. The sounds came next. Not the usual swamp noises I'd known all my life, but something else. something that sounded almost like singing, but in a language I'd never heard before. I tried to be rational about it all. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was some kind of cult activity, or maybe someone was playing elaborate pranks. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The swamp itself felt different, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I didn't have to wait long to find out what that something was. 3 days after the light started, we got the call about the trappers. 3 men, experienced outdoorsmen who knew the swamp like the back of their hands, had been found dead in their boat. What was left of them anyway? Their spinal cords had been removed with surgical precision, and their faces were frozen in expressions of pure terror. That's when I knew we were dealing with something far beyond my experience as a park ranger, something that would change my life and my understanding of what's real and what's not, forever. And it was only the beginning. Part 2. Things get worse. The deaths of those trappers shook our small community hard. Everyone was scared, and people started carrying guns even to check their mail. Sheriff Mills set up a special task force, but honestly, they seemed as lost as I was. How do you track something that doesn't leave normal traces? But the worst part wasn't the deaths. It was what happened to people before they died. Sarah Jenkins, who worked at the local diner, told me she saw her husband Tom acting strange 3 days before he disappeared. It was like he wasn't himself, she said, her hands shaking as she poured my coffee. He'd stand in the yard at night just staring into the swamp. When I'd call him, he wouldn't even blink. They found Tom's body 2 days later, twisted in ways a human body shouldn't bend, like someone or something had played with him like a child's doll. I'll never forget the look on Sarah's face when we told her. More strange things started happening. The water in parts of the swamp turned black as ink, but when we tested it, the lab said it was normal water. People reported seeing their loved ones in places they couldn't possibly be, and those lights in the swamp, they were getting closer to town. Then there were the trees. I found the first marked one on a routine patrol. Someone or something had carved symbols into the bark. They looked old, like they'd been there for years, but I knew that stretch of swamp like my own backyard. Those marks were new. Each day, more trees showed up with the same weird symbols. I started keeping a journal of everything strange that happened. It helped me feel like I was doing something useful, even though I had no idea what I was dealing with. But one pattern became clear. The attacks were getting worse, and they were getting closer to town. That's when Marie Thibodeau came into my life. She showed up at my office one rainy morning, soaking wet but standing straight as a cypress tree. Her family had lived in these swamps for generations, and she said she knew what we were dealing with. I'd learned to be skeptical of such claims, but something in her eyes told me she was different. "You found the gators with the stone eyes, yes?" she asked in her slight Cajun accent. When I nodded, she pulled an old book from her bag. "Then it's starting again, just like before, and we don't have much time." Looking at that weathered book on my desk, I had no idea it would lead us into the darkest chapter of our investigation, one that would test everything I believed about reality and cost us more than I could ever imagine. Part 3. The Truth in Old Pages. Marie and I spent the next few days going through her family's old records. The book she brought was a journal from 1851, written by her great-great-grandfather. The pages were yellow and fragile, but the story they told made my skin crawl. "See here," Marie said, pointing to a faded drawing that looked exactly like the symbols I'd seen on the trees. "These marks showed up back then too, right before people started disappearing." The journal told stories of a creature that could change its shape. Sometimes it looked like a wolf walking on 2 legs. Other times it could make itself look like anyone it wanted. But the scariest part was how it could control animals and even people. "My grandmother used to tell me that it's not just a monster," Marie explained, her voice soft but steady. "It's smart, it plans, and it comes back every few decades when the floods are high." As we dug deeper into the old records, we started seeing the pattern. Every 40 years or so, when the swamp waters rose above normal levels, the same things would happen. Marked animals, strange lights, people acting weird before they vanished. The last time was in 1923, and before that, 1883. But reading about it wasn't the same as seeing it. One evening, as Marie and I were checking some of the marked trees, we saw it ourselves. About 50 yards away, standing in knee-deep water, was something that looked like a man but moved all wrong. When it turned to look at us, its eyes glowed like hot coals. I raised my flashlight, but Marie grabbed my arm. "Don't," she whispered. "If it sees us looking at it directly, we're dead." We stood completely still, barely breathing, as the thing moved through the water. The gators around it followed like obedient dogs. Then it just disappeared, like smoke in the wind. Back at my office, Marie explained more. "The Rougarou isn't just trying to hunt," she said, spreading out an old map. "It's trying to create its own territory. These attacks, the symbols, they're all part of a bigger plan. And if it succeeds, we'll lose the whole swamp to it." I looked at the map where she'd marked all the recent attacks. They formed a perfect circle, with the old flooded cemetery right at the center. That's when we heard screams coming from outside. The search party we'd sent out that morning had just radioed in. They were under attack, and they needed help fast. I grabbed my gear, but Marie stopped me again. "Wait," she said, pulling something from her bag. "Regular bullets won't work. We need these." She handed me a box of silver bullets that had been in her family for generations. Looking at those shining bullets, I realized our investigation was about to become a hunt, and we weren't sure if we were the hunters or the prey. Part 4. Into the dark. The search party's radio kept crackling with broken screams and static. Marie and I took my boat, pushing it as fast as it would go through the flooded swamp. The full moon made the black water shine like glass, and every shadow looked like it might be hiding something terrible. We found the first boat empty, just drifting between the cypress trees. The second one was flipped over. And the third? Well, we found Ben Matthews sitting in it, staring straight ahead like he was in a trance. He wouldn't respond when we called his name. "Don't touch him," Marie warned, but it was too late. I'd already grabbed his shoulder. That's when Ben turned to look at me, and I saw his eyes had turned completely black. His voice wasn't his own when he spoke. "It's coming for all of you." Then Ben just slumped over, like a puppet with its strings cut. We never found the other 4 members of the search party. The next few days were a blur of more disappearances and strange sightings. People said they saw their missing loved ones walking through their yards at night, but when they went to look closer, the figures would melt away into shadows. Marie and I kept searching, following clues from her family's records. That's when we found something nobody knew about, a network of underwater caves beneath the swamp. We discovered the entrance by accident when we saw a gator swim straight into what looked like solid rock and disappear. "The water level's just right," Marie said. "These caves are usually underwater, but with the flooding, out here is air pockets inside. That's why it's happening now." We got diving gear from the rescue station and went in. The caves were like something from another world. Our flashlights showed old carvings on the walls, similar to the ones on the trees but much older. In one chamber, we found piles of bones, some animal, some human, some so old they crumbled when we touched them. But the worst part was what we found in the deepest chamber: fresh claw marks on the walls and floor, and pieces of clothing that matched what the missing people had been wearing. The creature was using these caves as its lair. "Look at these markings," Marie said, her flashlight beam shaking slightly. "They're dated: 1883, 1923, and now 1963. It's not random, it's a ritual. And it's almost complete." Just then, our lights caught something moving in the water. Something big. The splashing echoed through the caves, getting closer and closer. Marie grabbed my arm and pointed to a small tunnel. "Run," she whispered. "It's coming home." We barely made it out of those caves. As we swam to the surface, I could have sworn I heard something laughing behind us, a sound that was almost human, but not quite. When we finally got back to my boat, Marie's face was pale. "We know where it lives now," she said, wringing water from her hair. "But that means it knows we were there, and it won't like that we found its secret." Part 5. The missing piece. Back at my office, Marie and I spread everything out on my desk. The old journal, maps showing where people had disappeared, and photos of the cave drawings. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, but neither of us noticed. We were too busy trying to figure out what the creature was planning. "Look at this pattern," Marie said, connecting dots on the map. "Every time it comes back, it takes exactly 13 people. And now," she counted the missing persons reports on my desk. "We're at 12. A chill ran down my spine. "One more to go." Marie nodded, her face serious. "But it's not just about taking people. Those symbols we found, they're part of something bigger. The creature is trying to make this place its own. If it finishes the ritual, it won't just hunt here anymore. It'll own these swamps forever. How do I stop it?" She pulled out an old piece of paper, yellow with age. "According to my great-great-grandfather's notes, the ritual has to be completed in the same place it started, the old cemetery. And it has to be done when the water is at its highest point." I checked the flood measurements. "That's tomorrow night." Just then, the lights in my office flickered. Through the window, we could see those strange blue-green lights dancing in the swamp, closer than ever before. They seemed to be calling to us. "It's getting stronger," Marie whispered. "Can you feel it?" I could. The air felt heavy, like right before a big storm. My head hurt, and strange thoughts kept trying to creep in, thoughts that weren't mine. I wanted to walk into the swamp, to follow those lights. Marie slapped me hard across the face. "Don't look at them, that's how it gets you." I shook my head, trying to clear it. "What do we do?" "We have to stop it tonight, before it can take its final victim. The silver bullets will hurt it, but the here is something else." She hesitated. "The ritual goes both ways. If we can turn it against the creature, we might be able to trap it underground forever. But someone would have to be there, right next to it, close enough to speak the words that will seal the trap." She didn't say what we both knew. That person probably wouldn't survive. Outside, an owl screeched, but it didn't sound quite right. More like something trying to copy an owl's call. We looked at each other and knew it was watching us. I checked my gun, making sure the silver bullets were loaded. "How long until sunrise?" "Too long," Marie said, gathering her things. "We need to get to the cemetery now, and Derek." She grabbed my arm. "No matter what you see or hear tonight, remember, it lies. It will try to trick us by looking like people we know. Don't trust anything you see." As we stepped outside, the swamp had never felt more alive or more dangerous. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound felt wrong. We were about to face something that had been hunting in these waters for over 100 years. And it was ready for us. Part 6. The Last Stand. The old cemetery looked like something from a nightmare. Floodwaters had risen up to the tops of the gravestones, and that strange black water seemed to move in ways water shouldn't. The moon cast enough light for us to see the symbols glowing on every tree around us, giving off a sickly green color. "There," Marie whispered, pointing to the center of the cemetery where a small island of land still stuck up above the water. "That's where it'll try to finish the ritual." We pulled our boat up behind a large cypress tree and waited. The sounds of the swamp had gone completely quiet. No frogs, no crickets, nothing. Just the gentle splash of water against the graves. Then we heard it, a sound like someone walking through water, coming from all directions at once. Marie grabbed my hand and squeezed it. "Remember," she whispered, "don't trust what you see." Suddenly, I saw my dad walking across the water toward us. He'd been dead for 10 years, but there he was, looking exactly like I remembered him. "Son," he called out, "why are you doing this? Come home." My heart felt like it was being squeezed. I knew it wasn't really him, but it looked so real. Marie's grip on my hand tightened. "It's not your father," she said firmly. The thing wearing my dad's face smiled, but the smile was all wrong, too wide, with too many teeth. Then it changed, its shape melting like wax, until it looked like a wolf standing on 2 legs, but bigger than any wolf should be. Its eyes glowed that same sickly green as the symbols. "Now!" Marie shouted. I raised my gun and fired. The silver bullet hit it in the shoulder, and the creature screamed, a sound like metal scraping on metal. But it didn't fall. Instead, it dove into the water and disappeared. "Where is it?" I whispered, turning in circles, my gun ready. "Everywhere," Marie said. She had started drawing symbols in the air with something that looked like ash. "The water is part of it now. We have to finish this quick." The water around us started to churn. Dark shapes moved beneath the surface, dozens of alligators, all with those strange stone eyes, circling our boat. The creature rose up behind them, twice as big as before, its fur dripping black water. I fired again and again, each silver bullet making it shriek and stumble. But it kept coming. Marie had started chanting something in French, her voice getting louder with each word. The symbols she'd drawn in the air started to glow. The creature knew what she was doing. It lunged for her, faster than anything that big should be able to move. I jumped in front of her, firing my last bullet straight into its chest, but I was too late. Its claws caught me, throwing me against a gravestone. Through blurry eyes, I saw Marie complete her ritual. The glowing symbols shot toward the creature like lightning, wrapping around it like chains. "Derek," she shouted, "get to the boat! Now! Not without you! It has to end here!" The symbols were burning brighter, and I could see they were burning Marie too. She had become part of the ritual. "Get out while you can!" The creature thrashed and howled, trying to break free. The water began to spin like a whirlpool, pulling everything toward the center where Marie stood. She looked at me one last time. "Tell them I helped save the swamp." Then the ground cracked open beneath her feet. In a rush of black water and blinding light, Marie, the creature, and a large section of the cemetery were pulled down into the earth. The noise was deafening, rushing water, screaming, the crack of trees splitting. Then, just as suddenly, everything went quiet. I sat in my boat until sunrise, watching the muddy water settle. The symbols on the trees had faded away. The alligators were gone. The swamp seemed normal again. But I knew it would never be the same for me. They never found Marie's body or any sign of the creature. The official report blamed the deaths on a combination of flooding and wild animal attacks. Most people were happy to believe that. But sometimes, on very quiet nights when the moon is full, I think I can still see those blue-green lights dancing far off in the swamp. When I do, I make sure to look away. And I say a quiet thank you to Marie Thibodeau, who gave her life to keep the darkness from taking over our home. Just in case you are ever down here in the Atchafalaya, when the waters are high and the moon is full, stay out of the swamp. Some things are better left alone, and some sacrifices should be remembered.